Hi, welcome to my presentation on Peru and how it is portrayed in American media. Due to the content of this presentation, I'm actually going to do a relatively different format. This is over a Zoom screen sharing, which will allow me to go through news articles with you, and so that you can see the news articles and what is being, how they're being, Peru is being portrayed in American media. So the motivation for this project came from coming back from Peru and reading news articles about Peru and noticing that everything was slightly off. So SST taught me that we need to take great care about writing about cultures that are not our own. So during SST, we did do quite a bit of writing about Peru, but you need to be really cautious because it is difficult to write about foreign cultures. I'd like to add a disclaimer here. There's lots of talks about fake news, press bias in the US. This is not that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that individual journalists have a difficult time writing about other cultures, and so that makes the whole thing sometimes inaccurate, whereas certain politicians might say that the press is intentionally being disaccurate. I'm not saying that. I'm talking about biases around other cultures. So three biases that I'd like to talk about in areas that are made are not placing stories within the proper historical context, ignoring the marginalized, which is easier to do in your own society, but even easier to do around other societies, and interpreting another society through the lens of your own. So let's talk about some historical context for Peru. So in the colonial times, Cusco was the center of Spain's wealth. The mountains, the gold they discovered in the mountains was what fueled the rise of the Spanish Empire. Lima was the administrative center of the Spain's empire in the New World. So Peru, the two big cities in Peru are really the two cities that fueled the Spanish colonial empire. And so this is not a historically poor country. This is a historically wealthy country. It's the home of the Inca. It is a powerful country historically. In the 1980s, Peru experienced awful civil war. There is a terrorist group known as the Shining Path that tried to rise up using terror attacks to scare people in rural areas into joining them, and then slowly crushing in towards the cities. Fortunately, that was unsuccessful, thanks in large part to this politician right here, Alberto Fujimori. As I mentioned, he was successful in stopping the Shining Path. He was very successful economically. He turned Peru around and actually significantly decreased inequality, which is one reason why he's so popular in many of the poor parts of Lima today. And he tried to become a dictator, and he was unsuccessful at that. So again, everything today centers around Fujimori. He's so important. Remember, good economics, good for stopping the civil war, incredibly corrupt. That's what you need to know about Fujimori. So moving on, since Fujimori, every single Peruvian politician, not politician, but president has been corrupt. So every single president since him has gone to jail for corruption, and that includes the last 6 presidents. In 2018, this vice president, Martin Vizcarra, became president. And he really propagated this myth of him as the outsider, the reluctant leader, you know, kind of like that George Washington type myth where he did not want to become president, but it was thrust upon him. How much of that is true is actually quite debatable. But he wasn't elected president, it was pushed on him. And he has been strongly anti-corruption. And so he has clashed repeatedly with Congress. And actually, many of the Congress people that he's clashed with the most were elected in the 90s and were close allies of Alberto Fujimori. And he has actually kind of been, yeah, so he has strong bona fide anti-corruption. He's strongly known as being anti-corruption, and he is incredibly popular. Twice he's been impeached. The first time, the uprisings were so strong, hundreds of thousands of Peruvians in the streets, and then so the military ended up backing him, and he was restored to the presidency. The second time happened this last weekend. It happened on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So it's a rapidly unfolding situation. What we know right now is that the president who Congress instilled to replace him has resigned because he knew that he did not have a majority of the people. It's currently unknown whether Vizcarra will be restored to the presidency again, or whether somebody else will take the presidency. So we're kind of in the fog of the present. We don't know exactly what's happened and what's happening right now. So that is one interesting thing about this presentation. It has changed a lot in the last couple of days. So let's talk about the failure of several American news sources to place stories within the proper historical context. So this is one article that I'm going to come back for with all three of the heirs, and I'm going to show how they are propagated through this article. And it's actually not even a bad article. It's actually quite interesting. So George Feiseth was a very popular Peruvian soccer star. And upon retiring, he went into politics, and he became the mayor of this large downtown district that's quite upper middle class. So when talking about this, he's also highly anti-corruption. And so this article is discussing him and talking about him potentially running for office in the next election. So a self-described centrist, Feiseth has focused on local issues like crime. Let's see here. A sign his office said of his administration's mission to wipe out corruption. So they're talking about his strong anti-corruption bona fides. But what they fail to mention is the fact that the last 6 Peruvian presidents have gone to jail for corruption. So they're not really explaining how deep corruption is in Peruvian society and why an anti-corruption president might be fare well in future elections. Furthermore, they fail to mention Vizcarra as well. And Vizcarra is he's probably the only popular Peruvian politician. I actually did a project on the politics in Peru when I was there. And I think that is something that you could easily say is that in many cases, he's the only popular Peruvian politician, and he's known for being strongly anti-corruption. So to talk about another Peruvian politician who's strongly anti-corruption without discussing Vizcarra, who many Americans would not know, fails to inform those Americans about the news they're reading. So then this next article also fails to place COVID in its historical or the impeachment of Vizcarra in its historical context. So this is a relatively new article. Let me pull it up here. So this article was written November 12th. So it was written Thursday. And it's discussing the second impeachment of Vizcarra, right? He was the face of the resistance. That's right here. It does discuss about the former president's being in jail for corruption, but it fails to mention his first impeachment. So you're writing an article to Americans, most of whom have no idea who Martin Vizcarra is. You're talking about his second impeachment, and you fail to mention that he's been impeached 6 months before. Furthermore, you fail to mention that the Peruvian people came out in the streets to prevent that impeachment from going through, but that he's being impeached again, and due to COVID, it looks like it has been successful. And so this feels like an example where the author of this article, which is the Associated Press did not provide the facts that are necessary for people to understand this article. Not that this article isn't true, and it does talk about things in a relatively true way, but it doesn't make it so that the average American reading this article can understand what is going on. So this fails to place the article and the story that it's talking about in its proper historical context. So this next error that we can make is that it is easy to ignore the marginalized of society. So I'm going to return once again to this Latin America quarterly article, which I discussed first. It's talking about La Victoria. So it's a district of over 200,000 people, and it discusses that it's a working class neighborhood. And it discusses it as a working middle class neighborhood. And that's really not true. It really could be more accurately described because it's Central Lima as a upper class neighborhood. Furthermore, it talks about his economic policies. It briefly touches on his economic policies. Let's see here. Informality. So informality is not a word that many Americans will understand what they're talking about when they're talking about politics, but every single Peruvian is going to understand this. So informality talks about street vendors, street markets that aren't technically like, not legal, but they're not like formal markets. It also discusses these cheap taxis called motos that are ubiquitous throughout the outer conos of Lima, but they're not allowed in any of the inner districts. So a politician in La Victoria who is fighting against informality is fighting against a majority of the residents of Lima who reside in the outer conos, because a vast majority of Lima is in the outer conos, and is struggling to survive, and is struggling because of the policies of inner Lima, such as informality. And so they're discussing informality, but they're not discussing the effect that it has on the 8 million residents of the conos. And so they're not discussing who's important. They're not discussing a majority of the residents. This second article is on COVID. And it's discussing, if you don't know, Peru is #1 in deaths per capita, which is a really sad fact. It's gone horribly, and anybody who's gone to Lima knows that Lima is a tinderbox. Particularly the poor outer areas of Lima, you knew it was going to be a disaster, and unfortunately it has been. But this article tries to discuss what's gone wrong in Peru. So let's take a look at it. So a couple of things that it blames is these large outdoor markets, which, yeah, you could see them spreading, being large spreaders of COVID. The informal economy, it talks about the informal economy, banks, and social distancing, particularly in the house. What it fails to mention is it fails to mention how a vast majority of Limanians live. So a vast majority of Limanians live in areas where they're traveling 1 to 2 to 3 hours on crowded public transportation. They're jammed into buses. You might have 100 people in one normal size US school bus, and that's normal in Peru. Under normal times, in COVID, that's crazy. It fails to mention the fact that people can't take off work in an informal economy. So this really, again, fails to analyze COVID from the perspective of the marginalized of Lima. Okay, so let's look at the last thing, which is that when we write about cultures that are not our own, is it is easy to view them through the lens of our own society. So again, we're going to go back to this America Quarterly. And the idea of the middle class is tied in closely with the idea of the American dream. And the fact that is that in Peru, the middle class isn't nearly as big a thing as it is in Peru. So for Sith, being the champion of the middle class is not what Peruvian politicians would strive for. The Peruvian politicians would strive for support among three groups. Inner city, very wealthy, educated Lima. The Conos, very poor, very uneducated outer Lima. And the provincias, very rural, very uneducated. Now I'm painting in very broad strokes, but those are the three groups roughly that Peruvian politicians are aiming for. And you can tell that none of those are working class Peruvians, right? Peru is a much more striated, much more unequal society than US. And so we're trying to analyze Peruvian politics in the light of American politics, and the comparison just doesn't hold up. So let's look then at the second example. And this is I believe it's a Reuters article. And if you didn't know, Reuters is a center-right, very financially based news service. And this was written in early March, right? So these the news markets were going crazy. What's going to happen? What is COVID going to do to the world economy? And let's see how they portray Peru's actions. So they were also, you should keep in mind that conservatives at that point were really railing against the US's, in the words, draconian actions to stop the spread of COVID. So what they discussed is, if you get around here, in Lima, troops wearing helmets and carrying weapons stationed themselves at the Paseo de la República Avenue, a key artery in the city center, to stop vehicles, with police officers only allowing emergency and medical vehicles through. So the beginning of that makes it sound like a very, very draconian military-based society. And the fact is that in Peru, when you see police officers, they are always going to be carrying helmets and combat weapons. That happens whether you were there, as I was 2 summers ago, or whether you're there now. So they're trying to make it sound like this is a draconian action to stop COVID, whereas it's a normal action to stop COVID. Let's look at this also, how they describe Peru. Read this line. The copper producer has suspended constitutional rights. First off, let's talk about suspending constitutional rights. Again, makes it seem like a much more draconian action. And second, to refer to a country of 30 million as a copper producer shows your bias. That is how Reuters looks at Peru, as Peru is a copper mine for the US. And that's how they're looking at Peru, not Peru as an individual country of 30 million with diverse people, diverse cities, but they're just a copper producer for us. They're a copper mine for the US. And so that's how Reuters is looking at the US. They're putting Peru in the American story, and they're coming up with an incorrect analysis. Not incorrect, but not complete analysis. So in conclusion, let's talk about intentionality, because many of this does not seem to be intentional, particularly the first two is failing to properly provide the historical context, and failing to read in the marginalized of the society are often not intentional errors. Now the third one, writing another story into your story, that one tends to be more intentional. That one is one you should look at and be very, very skeptical about. Let's talk about fairness. Why is it the US in England, and why are these the global news articles that are being written about Peru? There's questions about that. Why are Peruvians not writing more of these global articles about Peru and about Latin America? And I think that this really could be extended to the rest of the developing world. you as an educated American should be very, very skeptical when you read even well-respected news sources in the US. When they're talking about the developing world, you should be skeptical. You should look at it in the eyes of, through the eyes of a Peruvian. Try to look at it through the eyes of somebody who understands that culture and know that you might not be getting the whole story. Okay, thank you.